And we have a new guest today, Andy Kaufman. And we're going to talk about a lot of things: bacteria, what makes people sick, the idea of detoxification, all kinds of things like this. And then in hour two, we're going to open up and address some maybe more immediate concerns. If you follow what I'm saying, welcome, Jason.
Good morning, Crow. And it's a fine good morning here in Louisiana.
So we're starting off at square one. We had quite a lead going. Now we're going to have to catch up. But do you have anything for the introduction here that matters?
I think just a few reminders that we have the soundtrack up on CD Baby, if anybody's interested. There's a few new t-shirts up on the Teespring shop. The live streams, if anybody's not aware, every Sunday, you and I do a live stream on my Secrets of Saturn channel from 5 to 6 p.m. Central, which is my time, so 6 to 7 Eastern. And that's at the same time we did TFR. And then every Wednesday from 8 to 10 Central, Wayne McCroy and I do a live stream. And sometimes Crow joins us there as well.
Right. Okay. There's all the stuff. Shall we continue?
Let's move.
All right. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Good morning, guys. It's really an honor to be on your show.
Hey, I'm looking forward to this. As we went over the topics and arranged them carefully so that they could be delivered to as many minds as possible, there's a number of very interesting things here. And if you have followed our work, you might be familiar with some of the naturopath, homeopath, well-trained doctors in many disciplines, to include Ayurvedic and maybe Asian or Chinese styles of what we call medicine, to include the work that the Germans have done, some really cutting edge work that was supposed to be announced around how people get sick and viruses and these ideas, but apparently that was never published. But you want to jump right in here? I'll get us started if you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've approached this kind of a long strategy. So coming from my background in medicine, I started just noticing that the things that I was trained to do as an allopathic physician were not successful. And so I started investigating that further, looking at the research literature, and I started seeing that actually there's quite a bit of mortality and morbidity, which are the medical words for kind of death and destruction, that actually are caused by our practice of medicine. And once I realized this and started questioning things, it was kind of like peeling the layers of an onion. I kept going down deeper and deeper, and ending up at a very fundamental level, realizing, as in many other areas, when you start to investigate truth, that once you get down to the base assumptions that you are working under and question those, and those are actually not true, it's like a house of cards that everything can fall apart. And I see lots of people, like you mentioned, you had several excellent guests on your show before talking about other orientations of medicine and natural healing. And I listen to a lot of those people, and I'm always looking for new information, new wisdom. And what I see, though, is that many people have recognized at the higher levels that something is not right with our healthcare system and with how we think about disease and health. But they haven't gone down to this fundamental level. And once you see that some of the, basic underlying arguments that our healthcare system were created on are actually based completely not in the truth, then everything else you look at through different lens. So whereas before I saw, simply a clinical study showing a bad outcome, now I would be looking at that and saying, well, the whole basis for what the healthcare system did to these people is based on fallacy. So looking at the outcome itself makes it a much more dire finding, because you see that it's not that they did something that helped some people and harmed a few people, but it's that they did something that couldn't have really helped because it wasn't based on how our bodies work. And in the process of doing that, a lot of people were harmed and no one was really helped. So it's been, quite a personal revolution for me going through this process to arrive at these conclusions. And I think, to get to that base level, we have to look at the paradigm of healthcare and what it's based upon.
Do you want to give your background just so everybody knows right exactly where you're coming from? Because that's probably really important to understand for the listeners just how well trained you are and what you're looking at and saying, hey, I see problems here.
Right, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I studied molecular biology and chemistry as an undergraduate, and I went on then to become a physician assistant, which is like a mid-level provider. So I worked directly with physicians. And I took that job actually as a junior faculty member of the medical school in South Carolina, working on the hematology and oncology service. So I was working with cancer patients, bone marrow transplant patients, people with rare blood disorders, very, very sick people. And that's where I got my real first taste of seeing that, really no one was cured of cancer that I worked with. Pretty much everyone died. There was, like one rare cancer that had a very unique treatment that was actually based on vitamin A. And those people got better. But, I saw like 2 people that had that illness in 2 years, and everyone else that got all of the traditional therapies, the bone marrow transplant, chemotherapy, radiation, even some immune therapies that were budding at the time, everyone died of those people. So then I went on, continued my education, went to medical school, earned my MD from the Medical University of South Carolina, and decided to study and specialize in psychiatry. So I went to Duke for my residency there, and then continued my training in upstate New York for a fellowship in forensic psychiatry. So I'm trained in those specialties, and I continued to work in academic medicine for the earlier part of my career, held several leadership positions, conducted some research, have several published articles and book chapters. And then luckily, I moved out of the academic realm and experienced a lot of kind of negative things there in terms of politics and et cetera. And now practicing on my own. And once I really woke up to this truth about healthcare, I began investigating alternatives and looking for what's really going on with our health and our bodies.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll lead us in here. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to rephrase that. We'll leave the nuts for the evening news and we'll get into the bolts here. There's been a lot of to-do about germ theory. Online, people can do just easy searches to see how many people are going in to rethink, to challenge germ theory, and this includes bacteria and viruses. And there's a thing called terrain theory. So why don't you jump in there, Andy, and we'll talk about germ theory, bacteria and viruses, and whatever the heck it is that is called terrain theory.
Absolutely. And, this is such a central thing to understand at this fundamental level, as I was saying before, because the big paradigm of our healthcare system is a warfare model, right? We're always we're fighting against an invader that comes into our body, right? There's a war on cancer. There's a war on drugs, right? We have this warfare mentality in many areas, but it's central in healthcare. And it's based on germ theory. And so what germ theory is, and which was basically told to me as fact, even though it's called germ theory, it was taught to me in my medical education, but even way before that, in my biological education as fact. And what it says is that basically disease is caused by an agent that comes from outside our body and invades and causes that disease. And there are some people who think that, or have thought historically, that this was the cause of all disease. But certainly there's a big push in medicine to find an infectious agent for almost every disease possible, including diseases that you would think have nothing to do with infections, like autoimmune diseases. So this is a very, very central thing. The basis of all treatment of infections is based upon germ theory. The thing is that germ theory is not based upon good science. And there was a vigorous debate about the origin of life and the origin of disease in the 1800s, mid to late, even into the 20th century. And the debate wasn't quite over when Pasteur's germ theory was taken up by the mainstream and promoted as the new medical paradigm. And so Pasteur actually didn't even come up with the idea. He basically plagiarized another scientist, Antoine Béchamp, who was his contemporary, but a much more serious scientist. And throughout his career, Pasteur plagiarized and stole several findings and ideas from Béchamp. Even pasteurization was not Pasteur's idea originally. So Béchamp was a very brilliant scientist, and he did a number of experiments about fermentation. And fermentation was seen as a model of life and of transformation of life. So they were thinking about, what makes an organism alive or dead? What's the origin of life? There was a pre-existing theory of spontaneous generation, that essentially the body of an organism is like a sterile environment, and there was a spontaneous generation of life into that organism that resulted in the living being. And Béchamp did a number of experiments, and one of the early experiments that actually led to the germ theory was where he had several flasks of sugar solution that he mixed with different salts, and some of them had air in the container and some of them did not have air. And he looked at the fermentation products of these vessels. And he found that many of them actually didn't ferment, the ones that had no air and the ones that had certain salts that may have inhibited growth. But what he learned from this is that the microorganisms that were already discovered to be involved in fermentation actually came from the air. So this was kind of a preliminary experiment. And when he discovered they came from the air, then that could mean that germs that cause disease come from the air. I want to just back up a second, because I think language is very important to understand in this whole realm. And the word germ itself, actually, the meaning of that is a bud or a shoot. So it has a meaning of new life or new growth. And taking that word and turning it into a description or a meaning of a villain, something that invades your body and causes disease, is quite an inversion of meaning there. And, I think that's, I'm not sure where the term originally was coined, but it's really not used properly in this current paradigm. So Béchamp had this discovery, and then about 2 years later, Pasteur basically copied this experiment, but he did it in a very sensational way, where he loaded up these bottles and went on like a tour of the French vineyards and captured air at the different vineyards to show that there are different germs in the air at different places that could cause fermentation. And but it basically just replicated Béchamp's experiment. And then at a meeting later, Pasteur gave the results of this and claimed it was his own idea. And when Béchamp at the end got up to refute and say that he originally discovered this, Pasteur just ran out of the building and didn't even give him a chance to sort of confront him.
We should interject here. We've done a number of episodes talking about fermented foods and how healthful many of them are. The idea being that you're eating something with life in it, like cheese used to be before the idea of pasteurization by Louis Pasteur, we are told. I get emails from places like Switzerland, all over Europe, all the time, saying we still have cheese that's not been pasteurized. It's living. So really kind of what you're pointing to is what Pasteur was involved in was basically convincing everyone to cook the life out of everything we ingest. Wasn't that a big part of it?
Absolutely. Well, if the life is what causes disease, then you have to get rid of it. Right. And this is, obviously, it's just like antibiotics. Right. Look at the meaning of that word. Right. It means against life. So we're using it to try to improve our health, but it's against life. It is a big contradiction here in this warfare model.
So let's back up a minute and be very clear. It makes you wonder in World War II if the prefix germ was being somehow mentally manipulated as the Germans invaded everywhere. But that's a side thought. Let's get back to the germ theory. And as you pointed out, it's called germ theory. It's a bit like gravity, right? Gravity is a theory based on a theory, and yet it is treated like a law. And you would think something of that much, and I'll make the pun, gravitas, would be proved out to be a law, a solid thing that we can prove. Right. So we're looking at a similar idea here, but let's get back to bacteria and viruses. Is the underlying, and by the way, we still need to, was that a definition of terrain theory? If not, we need to make sure we let people know what terrain theory is. But bacteria and viruses, so what's the bottom line here? Are they misdescribed? Is what they are and how they affect us misdescribed? Is that the idea?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of disease, it is. But I think it's important to mention that Béchamp did additional experiments that basically showed that the microorganisms can come from inside as well. So he did these experiments with decaying dead cats, for example. And these organisms were able to undergo putrefaction without any air or outside contamination at all. And what happened is that there were these tiny little particles left at the end when all of the tissue was gone. And he called these microzyma. And these little particles are basically the origin of all of these single-celled microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. And it's been shown through other experiments that they exist in all of us, in all plants and animals. And for example, in humans, you can see them in the red blood cells under a dark field microscopy. This is another thing about life and death. When medicine takes samples from your body and looks at it under the microscope, they're always looking at dead tissue. So they take the sample of tissue and they apply chemicals to it that essentially fixes and kills the tissue. I mean, things like formaldehyde, and then they apply stains. So when you're looking at those tissues under the microscope, you can't see how they behave at all. They're completely dead. It would be like if you were an alien trying to study the Earth and you wanted to, study dogs, then you would go and find a dead dog and look at it under the microscope instead of find a living dog and observe it behave while it's alive. So there's another type of microscopy that was used by several of the German scientists that followed Béchamp and Pasteur, like Enderlein and Gaston Naessens, and where they could actually take a blood sample and visualize it alive under the microscope and observe how the cells behave and what happens. And so you can see in that type of microscopy, these little particles, which were called microzyma by Béchamp. They've had several names since then. Protids and somatids are the other two most common names used. And once they started observing these, then they basically mapped out a whole cycle where these little particles can be activated by environmental cues. So in other words, some place in your body needs them for some reason, and they bud out of the red blood cells, and they change their shape, and they can form basically bacteria or fungi in their ultimate iteration going through the life cycle. So they can basically differentiate into these terminal species that we would see under the microscope and identify as bacteria, even by conventional means. And so this is the origin, actually, of these microorganisms. They come from inside of us. And like I said, they're present in any plant and animal. And it was discovered that when these are taken out of the air, like those experiments where they cause fermentation, they basically were left behind from an animal or plant that died. And they were just kind of floating around, maybe looking for the next host that they might settle in. And it's quite interesting that after, your entire body decays, this is what's left, are these little microzyma. They seem to be immortal, that they don't perish and die the way that our human cells do. So the terrain medicine is sort of based on this discovery, and it looks at the role of these microorganisms in the world as the same as in your body, which is they are the nature's scavengers and cleanup crew and recyclers. So when there is tissue damage, they respond to come in and clean it up and help repair the area. And so they're incidental to disease, but not the cause of disease. And that's essentially what terrain medicine says, is that the soil of the body, or the terrain of the body, the tissues and cells of the body, if those are damaged, then there is disease. And then a whole series of things get set in motion to deal with that damage or disease. And the microorganisms are one important part of that.
So, Jason, I can already tell that we're probably going to have Andy back, because I'm looking at the list of very interesting things we have to go over, and we're still on the first bullet point. So what I'm going to do here, Andy, is
it's too much detail. I'm sorry.
Well, it's really not, and it's fine. When we have interesting guests with so much to offer, we typically do have them back. But for the sake of the first hour, I'd like to get in at least a number of topics, because I'm sure people want to hear about AIDS. Do viruses cause disease? The immune system, antibiotics, microbiome. I mean, there's a whole list in front of me, and we're still dealing with germ theory to try to paint a picture that people can understand. So on the germ theory, let me cut to the chase. Germ theory basically states that these foreign entities, for lack of a better description, get into our body and they make us sick. A lot of people are questioning this. Is it questionable if someone comes and says bacteria and viruses come from outside of us, get into our body and make us sick? Is that an acceptable thing for a human mind to accept? Or has that been challenged now? And there's every reason to think that we need to know a hell of a lot more before we just jump on these things are making us sick bandwagon.
Well, it's more like the germ theory was really jumping the gun, because that avenue of research was not fully explored yet. So it was really premature, and everything has been based on it because it provided this model, and it was provided a extremely successful commercial strategy forward through petrochemical medicine. So we have believed this for a century now, and people generally don't question this until very, very recently. But if you want to look at this as a scientist going back and reviewing the papers and seeing where they lead, you would have given up on germ theory a long time ago.
So let's just go back to words have meaning. If you see the word theory behind anything, what you're looking at is an unproven idea. I can make up an idea right now. I have this idea that we can breed pink monkeys that have pink fur. That's my pink monkey theory. And I know that's a bit absurd, but I think people understand what we're getting at. What I'm going to do here, Jason, is I'm going to skip one or two, get to the interesting points, and I'm going to kick it back over to you. So, Andy, there's this whole thing about AIDS that started years ago with a doctor who started looking carefully at the AIDS testing mechanisms. By the way, for some reason, Lord only knows why, most of these videos have been pulled from the internet. And basically at the time, it caused a whole bunch of people to look at this thing we call AIDS that they thought they knew about in a whole new light, thinking, wait a minute, we don't know anything about this and we need to re-examine it. And while I don't remember the exact specifics, I will try to draw from memory what started these unquestionable things that are now questionable. If I recall, the test was looking at a protein, and what the doctor did was demonstrated that it had no basis to walk away with an end result that this disease we call AIDS is the outcome of this test. What in fact was found was that people had been tested on one day and found to have AIDS, and tested on another and found not to. And the outcome of that line of research was that this is completely nonsensical. It is not founded in science. And this is all basically a falsehood. So let's get into your ideas. Can we talk about AIDS for a minute carefully?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because people will lose their damn minds if we don't thread the needle here.
Well, I think the HIV test is an excellent place to start because there are so many levels of obfuscation going on with this test. So first of all, let me just tell you that it's not FDA approved. Now, why the hell do we have an HIV test for one of the most important diseases of our generation, and it's not even FDA approved?
All right, you don't need to say anything more. I think everyone understands it. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to make a point here as carefully as I can, but go ahead.
Well, I understand the FDA is a low bar, but it couldn't even meet that low bar. So the way that Gallo, who did not isolate any virus, but the way he came up with the test is that he took some human immune cells, right, the kind that are supposedly infected in this illness, and he mixed them with some nasty chemicals that would put stress on them, chemical stress. He put in there hydrocortisone, okay, which is a corticosteroid. It changes the cells at the nuclear level, how they transcribe genes, and incubated these cells. So basically put these cells under stress. And what happens when cells are under stress? They initiate inflammation. They change shape. Some cells may undergo apoptosis, where it's like programmed cell death. They extrude protein fragments into the serum. So all these kinds of reactions that they have. So it's a great setup. There's all kinds of material for antibodies to bind to. And he basically just developed an antibody that binds to this kind of nasty, stressed cellular debris. And that's the HIV test. So anyone that is in a state of cellular stress, oxidative stress, can test positive. And there's at least 50 conditions that have been well characterized that can show a false positive HIV test, including things like pregnancy, hepatitis, et cetera, et cetera.
That's all very interesting for a simple reason. There are a lot of people out there today saying things like inflammation is the cause of all disease. And one of the things you said there was they basically caused inflammation. But this is part of the problem with the modern world that we live in. If we want to have an adult conversations about the validity of things like AIDS or viruses or other things, first of all, most of the people start to lose their damn minds if something is covered that they don't agree with, which is unfortunate. And secondarily, the censorship around all these things should let every mind know out there that when things are censored, there is a damn good reason to take a more careful look. I think we'll leave AIDS there for a minute. But Jason, do you want to jump in and steer this ship somewhere meaningful?
Well, I'm sure a lot of folks do want to know more about AIDS, but that's probably more of an hour 2 thing, I would say.
Absolutely, because I know what I want to say right now.
Well, I can certainly have a lot more to say on it as well.
And maybe we'll pick up on that. But why don't we jump down to viruses in general and what the mainstream says about viruses and what you might have come across and come to conclusions of about viruses.
I want to be blunt. Do viruses cause disease, Andy?
No, unless you're a bacteria, maybe.
All right, let's fake like none of that was said and go ahead and follow on with Jason's question.
Well, virus is another thing that you have to look at the meaning of the word, because the word virus comes from the Latin, and it means a noxious or poisonous substance. Okay, so it long predated this. And in fact, before the notion of what we think of as a modern virus was even understood, people used the term virus when they were studying disease as basically the poison that caused the disease, because there was always this view that there was some poison in the air causing the disease. So they used that term before this modern concept. But basically what happened is that viruses do exist in lower organisms. So in single cell organisms like bacteria and algae and amoebas.
I got to interrupt you, and I'm sorry for doing so, but this is a thing I want to ask you because it comes up so often. So many of the supposed images of what is called a virus have been by image experts shown to be CGI, like so much of the space stuff we see. Are there real images of viruses, first of all?
So yeah, that's what I was getting at. So these, like viruses that infect bacteria, they're called bacteriophages. And I've actually worked with these in the laboratory in college. And these have been seen under electron micrograph. There's lots of pictures you can find on the internet. In fact, I have this article from the University of California, San Francisco that has some excellent photos. And you can tell that they're real electron micrographs.
I'd like to post those in the comments forum under this episode, because I can't tell you how many emails will come about what we're talking about. So I'm
Absolutely.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And, one of the most prominent and sharpest scientists to talk about this issue is Dr. Stefan Leinke, who's a German scientist. And he actually started his career studying a virus that infects sea algae. And he isolated the virus. He was able to photograph it with an electron microscope, and he was able to characterize it biochemically. And those are basically the scientific criteria to identify a virus.
So you're saying that in the algae, there's a virus. You haven't told us whether it's a living thing or not. But what would happen, just to jump ship for a second here, if a human being ate that algae and the algae wasn't poisonous? what would become of that virus?
Well, let me tell you that the virus doesn't actually cause disease in algae. It actually plays a helpful role, like a symbiotic role, by exchanging genetic material. So I think what would happen is that it would basically not affect you at all, because one, it would probably be destroyed in your gut. But even if it wasn't, it has no ability to recognize human cells. It's specifically trophic, or can only identify, the algae that it lives with.
I apologize for pushing and shoving, but I want to get so much as I can into hour one. Are there other things we would call a virus that are found inside a human being that we could say are alive?
Yeah, so it's great that you talked about the pictures, because no virus that allegedly causes human disease has ever been isolated and then an electron micrograph or photograph has been produced of it, because it's never been seen. But there are lots of pictures. Some of the pictures, like you mentioned, are completely made up CGI pictures. Like there was recently a CDC thing on the current disease that showed a CGI like this, and it was very scary looking. It was a human cell that was in blue with a bunch of these red virus particles attacking it. Looked very scary, but that was completely made up, an artist's conception. But there are other pictures of micrographs that are real. They're real pictures, but they don't show an isolated virus particle. What they show is different things. So they showed those cellular breakdown products that I described earlier in the HIV test. Sometimes they show the inside of a cell, like a human cell, and then there's basically a particle there. But there's no way to say that particle is a virus. So like I saw an image like this that was in the endoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle inside of a human cell. And that's where proteins go for what's called post-translational processing. It's kind of like the finishing shop. They get little things added on, they get folded up a bit. And that's exactly what it would look like. It would look like a particle, the same as they called a virus on these pictures. So there's a lot of obfuscation about this. They're showing a picture of something. It's a real something, but they're just picking a little dot here and saying, oh, that's the virus, without any proof. There's not a special label, molecular label placed on it. There's no way it doesn't have any special shape. Like all the ones of the bacterial viruses, the bacteriophages, and other ones of small organisms like amoeba. There's some viruses that infect amoeba. You look at these pictures and you see they all have a unique shape, a very geometric shape, a very detailed shape, that you could identify these things as distinct entities, or distinct, at least a distinct image that you could recognize over and over again. But the pictures that are allegedly of the viruses infecting humans, there's no such thing at all.
It's kind of ironic. You could get a picture of this scary looking thing, give it some royal name, and then make it kind of purpley for max impact. But I want to get your reaction on this. We've had other very educated medical professionals from all over the world, training from all over the world, who had been working on the idea of what would be the best way to describe a virus. And lo and behold, there was German teams apparently doing cutting edge. So what's your reaction to this? It was suggested that a better way to describe viruses would be electromagnetic vampirism, to try to illustrate in some meaningful way how people could think about, like when someone has the flu. There's a good example. So someone's clearly sick. They've got diarrhea. They're throwing up. We typically call this the flu. The idea is that this living little thing we call a virus got in them. But what the German research and the other man, who I guess I won't name and do him a favor, was saying is that the conditions are electromagnetic. And when the conditions, it's like a low field happens or something, and it attracts the thing that makes you sick. But the idea behind it was it would be better described as an electromagnetic thing going on. And the idea of vampirism is basically it's sucking all your energy away. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think it's very interesting. And, the idea of sort of I think when you say vampirism, it reminds me of parasitism. And there are lots of parasite disease models, right, that we could adapt, and not just from humans, but from other organisms where the parasite can actually even change your behavior. It's quite interesting. And I've thought a lot about this in schizophrenia based upon some work of Jerry Marzinski and some others as well. But I can't really say that I'm aware of any evidence, like if you want to look at a disease, like let's just say the flu, okay, right? Because this is, we're told that the flu is caused by a virus. Most of us have had personal experience with the flu, so we know, that it's like a bad cold. It makes you achy. It's no fun. So if there's not a virus that causes it, what actually causes it? And so I want to say, I don't know for sure the answer to this. I'm searching for the answer to this. I think I know what some possibilities could be. So one thing I think that actually toxic exposures can explain a lot of these acute illnesses on a small scale. I think that there are possible psychologic causes. I've been learning a lot about German new medicine lately, which really delves deep into that. And I think there's some merit to that. And there also could be that some of these things could just be about renewal, that we go through a process. Like I heard this very interesting about colds one time, because, we tend to get colds during a certain season of the year, right? And our bodies always are undergoing cycles, and some of those cycles are seasonal. Like a lot of our biological cycles are, tuned to the sky clock. That's an area that I need to do more investigation about, but it's clearly true. So what if we just have some kind of renewal cycle, that in the beginning of the winter, around the solstice, that our upper airway is time to renew itself, and that it initiates this kind of upper respiratory infectious process as a way to clean up the damaged tissue from the year, there filtering out all the stuff in the air that we breathe, and et cetera. And it's just a renewal process. So that could simply be the cause of some of these things.
That's such an interesting idea, because it was 3 years ago, I got the flu twice in January, and I've only had what I would call a flu a very few times in my life. But this is what happened when you're going through it and everything is coming out of you everywhere. It feels like your body's trying to flush out. But what I recalled, and because I was really paying attention to it based on a lot of the research that we try to do, when I was through it, and it was pretty bad getting through it, boy, did I feel renewed as I came back out of feeling sick. But my point here is the whole time it felt like my body was trying to just flush itself out, if you follow.
Absolutely. Almost all the symptoms of an acute illness that we have are all for that purpose, right? All of the fluid that comes in washes the stuff out, and then, it runs out of our nose, it drips down our lungs, makes us cough, it gives us diarrhea, right? All sweating that we get with fever, all of that stuff is eliminating these toxins from our body. Right. And that's the main process, I think, that we undergo with recovery. And, I found in using some natural healing techniques, that if you simply support that function of your body, that you recover from illness much quicker.
How do you support that function of your body?
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways. So I think the best example that I've have found that just works amazing is if you have a gastrointestinal type of illness, an acute illness where you have diarrhea and vomiting. I've done this with my children several times. You take some activated charcoal, about 1 tablespoon for an adult, and basically what that does is it just binds up the stuff the germs your body's dumping inside the lumen of your gut. And once it's absorbed in that charcoal, then it can't cause any more symptoms. So it's basically kind of bound up and inactivated. And then if you're having that kind of an illness, you probably don't need anything to move it through your bowels, because you're already having the diarrhea and the hyperperistalsis. So you'll just get it out. So when I've done this several times, after that charcoal, there are no more symptoms.
Well, I don't know what you think you're doing with such a no-nonsense, common-sense approach. What's that all about? Don't we need like a pharmaceutical biochemist to come in and make something we've never heard? No, I'm making a joke here. But so if you take, for an adult, you said a tablespoon of activated, do you just take it with water? And by the way, I know people will probably think about this or have done this. I'm guessing that once you've done that, you know when it's come out the other end.
Yeah, yes, you definitely know. And, I mean, if you do this, there's a chance you might throw up and then it might come out that way, but it will still work. But yeah, you just put it in a glass of water, stir it around, drink it down. And, when you start feeling that grit in your mouth, then stop, add some more water, stir it again, because you don't want it to be too nasty, but it's really easy to do. When I give it to my kids, I add a little bit of juice in there to make it more palatable.
Can you go to any of these health food places and get activated charcoal that's fit for human consumption?
Well, you can even get it in any random local drugstore. It may not be in the ideal form. I try to get an organic form in a tin, but in a pinch, I had to go to the drugstore one time and they had these little capsules. So I just emptied out the capsules into water. I mean, it's charcoal. You can't mess it up that much.
Well, then let's take this a step further. What are your ideas about using this method as a preventative or a maintenance? What if someone decided once a week I want to take a teaspoon of this? Is there a reason to do it, or is there a reason not to do it?
Well, there is definitely a reason to have ongoing cleansing. I think because, and in fact, I wanted to read you a quote. It's not too long, but it introduces this topic because this is really the reason why we have to do so much detox right now. And this is from Nancy Turner Banks, who wrote an excellent book about AIDS. But she writes, over the last 100 years, as the result of rapid industrialization combined with cartelization, and particularly during the last 50 years, we've witnessed an unprecedented event in evolutionary biology. The massive toxic poisoning on an unimaginable scale of the human metabolic system, not only from industrial products, but also industrial waste and increasingly from powerful electromagnetic fields, blah, blah, blah. And I want to add to that, and from food, which is, I think, one of the main sources. And because we have this bombardment and, we can do a lot to reduce our exposure, but we cannot eliminate it. Because, things like chemtrails and electromagnetic radiation that we just can't avoid altogether, air pollution.
Let me put a fine point on it. There's a movie that many people remember from the 70s called Oh, God, with John Denver and George Burns playing God. There is a scene in that movie which stuck with me all the way back when I first saw it in the 70s, where God is picking up a box of cereal in a 1970s grocery store, reads the ingredients and says, it's all chemicals. You're poisoning the kids. It's terrible. That was back in the 70s. But anyhow.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing 50 years ago. And, we still have the same thing. And we get fooled over and over again, for example, people that want to be vegan to improve their health. And then they go and eat all of these packaged and processed vegan foods that are just filled with chemicals and poisons.
It's unreal, the exposure of things we get. My wife and I now regularly, every day, we cold press juice, both a green version and a carrot or apple version based on the Gerson method, which, by the way, just so people know, as I say it all the time, actually cured people of serious diseases, many serious diseases, on the idea that if all your cells had the proper nutrition, you would no longer be sick. But I don't know if you're ready to move forward, but I'd like to get through a few more things. So can we jump into the immune system here? Is it possible that the immune system that's been described to us is not really the immune system?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really ties in to this detoxification scheme. So the immune system once again, it fits in with that warfare paradigm. That, it's there to defend us. It's like our army. Even some of the cells are called things like natural killer cells. That's pretty scary. But really, the immune system performs a support function. And if you can, look at the immune system after making a decision that germ theory is not accurate, you'll see things in a very, very different light. So the immune system does regulate when the microbes come and clean up damaged tissue and when they go away. And because they are the sort of the foreman, like the support crew, they manage everything, they coordinate all of these big activities, and they do respond to threats. I mean, if your skin is broken from trauma, right, that's a threat, and your body needs to repair itself, and the immune system is the main system that responds to those situations. But the immune system also is involved in regulating the toxins in your body. Actually, a great example of this would be the aluminum from vaccines, that there's some recent science on that shows how this is managed. And it's quite interesting because the immune system ends up carrying it around as a sort of a standby passenger or an unintended passenger when it responds to different parts of your body to an acute situation. So I think you really need to start looking at the immune system differently. The other area is an autoimmune disease. And I mean, does it really make sense that our body would attack itself? I mean, this grand design, so much complexity, and it works amazingly well. Why would it just attack itself?
Don't bring common sense into this conversation, please.
Well, it's just like, doctors wanting to remove parts of your body. Like, is there a part of your body that's really extraneous and not needed?
Well, is there?
No, I mean, wait
a minute. Are you telling me I needed that foreskin? Did I need that foreskin?
Well, possibly if you wanted some feeling there.
Yeah, you think? Unreal.
Now, you mentioned about autoimmune diseases. What about something like alopecia, which the mainstream blatantly calls an autoimmune disorder and makes all your hair fall out if you have the full-blown alopecia universalis?
Well, so the name of the autoimmune disease is alopecia areata. And so alopecia just means hair loss. And so it could be to varying degrees and a variety of causes. I think actually one of the main causes is malnutrition, with specifically connective tissue malnutrition. So hair loss is associated with several autoimmune disorders like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, if these are actually different things. But yeah, you definitely, I've seen patients like that, but it's also hard to tell did the hair loss come from the autoimmune disease or did it come from the treatment for the autoimmune disease? Because they're often using the same kind of therapies they use in cancer to treat autoimmune disease.
What about people who are born and then like at the age of 2, let's say, or 3, that their hair falls out? Boom. I have a friend whose son, it happened when he was around 12, I think.
Wow. Yeah, I've never encountered that myself. I don't know that it's a very common thing, but I would have to certainly, look at it case by case. I definitely worked with a teenager, or actually more than one, who pulled out their own hair and were essentially looked as if they were bald. And that's a psychological condition. It's called trichotillomania. And it had a purely psychological cause in the cases that I've been involved with. That was reversible. So I don't know. That's an interesting question.
All right, Andy, we're going to wrap up hour 1. There was so much more I wanted to get into hour 1 because it goes out everywhere. So I'm reasonably sure Jason and I are going to ask Andy back. And if for no other good reason, and there are plenty of good reasons, there's going to be a list left behind on the tail of 2 hours that has so many interesting things. And just let me talk about it. Antibiotics, are they deadly? The microbiome, what is it? What are the appendix? All the medicine we need is in nature. Medical errors, pharmaceuticals kill 150,000 people a year. Diabetes drugs killing people. Aluminum metals. I mean, it goes on and on. That is less than half of the list we're working from. But that does bring episode 203 to a close. So I'm going to ask you very quickly, Andy, is there a place where people can get in touch with you if they'd like to?
Yes, absolutely. I would encourage people to email me at Andrew Kaufman, MD at Proton Mail. And people can also look at my YouTube channel, which is under my name, Andrew Kaufman. It's called Medicamentum Authentica. All right. Hello. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my show. I'm Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and this channel is called Medicamentum Authentica. Today is April 3rd, 2020, and I have some very special guests I'd like to introduce to you. We have Dawn Lester and David Parker, the author of this excellent, well-researched book that I encourage you all to check out. They have done a couple of interviews lately and uncovering a lot of the fallacies and poor scientific conclusions in the medical community and in our medical system. And today we're going to talk about a very relevant topic to what's going on. We're going to be talking about viruses and germ theory. I'm very hopeful that this discussion you're about to see will clear up many of the questions that you have about these topics. I have been inundated with emails and messages with all kinds of questions about this, and I think this is going to be as close to a possible definitive response. And I encourage everyone out there to read further and do your own research and decide for yourself what you think about this issue. So welcome, David and Dawn.
Thank you very much, Andy, for having us on your show. We're looking forward to this as well.
Yes, definitely.
So what I was going to do, unless you have any objections, is for your listeners who obviously don't know us, is to just give a very brief reason as to why we wrote the book in the first place. And this came around really because of years ago, personal experiences within certainly my family. I've spoken about this before with various close family members and close friends who were diagnosed with various cancers. And they all, as we all thought, you take the standard medical advice and take the standard medical treatment and do everything that the physicians asked them to do. And unfortunately, all 6 people died. And this sort of came to a time when the medical establishment were always saying how much success they were having with cancer in fighting it, and things were getting better, and they were sort of having a 50% success rate. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't correlate with my own personal experiences where they've had a 100% failure rate. So that was probably the first big hit, because it's quite emotional too, as to that there's something wrong with the medical establishment's treatment, and also in what we're being told by the government and the medical establishment. It didn't correlate.
Right. So, well, David, if I may interrupt for a second, that's a really excellent point. And earlier in my career, I was a physician assistant, and I worked in a Department of Hematology and Oncology for 2 years, and I took care of patients with all kinds of cancers, focusing on cancers of the blood system. And I share the same exact experience. There was almost no one who survived.
Sure. And the little other interesting point of this was another relative who was an elderly lady who was also diagnosed with cancer. And but she flatly refused to, as she put it, be messed about by the medical establishment.
Good for her.
Quite a strong-minded
Exactly.
elderly lady, and she refused anything at all. And she said, "I'll just get on with it, and what happens, happens." And over a period of a year or two, because they still wanted to see how she was getting on, and I guess after about 2 years, they were able to say that, so your cancer's actually completely disappeared. And she lived a nice, healthy life into very old age. So.
Wow.
All of this added to, I was thinking, well, this is very strange. All the people in my family and friends who followed the medical establishment died, and the one that didn't is still alive. So that's really what sort of kicked it off. I thought there's something wrong. There's something very wrong. So Dawn and I were writing another book, which was absolutely nothing to do with the medical establishment whatsoever. But there was a section in it where we needed some information about viruses. And so we thought, well, we don't know a great deal about it at that time, and we're going back some years now. So we'll have a look into it. And the first thing that I guess that we really came across was that there was a controversy over HIV/AIDS, which we didn't know about. We didn't know there was any controversy at all. But the more we looked into it, the more we thought, this was not a clear-cut case. There was quite a lot of high-powered, if you like, educated people. I'm thinking of like Dr. Peter Duisberg and others that were saying, there's something very wrong with this. We doesn't believe there's a virus at all that's causing AIDS. So that was our first wake-up call, if you like, when we thought, oh, okay, well, we'll look into this. And Dawn and I decided right from the outset that we would not take anything for granted. We'd look for the evidence. We wouldn't take anything that anyone said in authority unless we could find the evidence to support it. So that was really what kicked off the present book, which was, we thought, well, we'll ask the most basic question of all, which is, well, what really makes you ill? Hence the title of the book. And we continued our research on that to look, not to just, if you like, attack the medical establishment. That wasn't in our minds at all, because we knew doctors and nurses, some family members, and we knew that they were always trying to do their best. They were following the rules, they were following the guidelines, they were following their education. But of course, if what you're being taught is wrong and you don't know, then you're doing the best thing, but it's not going to work out right. And of course, that's what's really been happening. So we thought, right, well, we won't take any of that for granted. If we can find evidence to support what's being said, then fair enough, whether it was about viruses, bacteria, vaccinations, whatever it was. But we wanted to see the evidence. And it was a big surprise to both Dawn and I that we couldn't find it anywhere. We got led down all sorts of tracks, but the real hard evidence, any proper primary scientific papers, were just not there. And we came across other people who looked the same, such as Carrie Mullis, who people may remember invented the sort of PCR, which he won a Nobel Prize for. And he's on the record of saying, that he did exactly the same for the HIV, AIDS, the virus. And he said the scientific papers are not there. And coming from a guy like that, unfortunately he's not with us anymore, but coming from a guy like that who knows what he's talking about, we thought, yeah, we're really onto something here. It's a big thing that we're having crammed down our throats, if you like, worldwide. When it first came up in the 80s that, it was going to be such a pandemic, word we've heard a lot of just lately, millions are going to die sweeping across the world and we're all doomed, type of thing.
Yeah, well, David, if I may interject something. So actually, Carrie Mullis was the first person I heard and talk about the questionable origin and scientific evidence for HIV as well. And it just occurred by accident. I was looking at a totally different issue that Carrie Mullis also was talking about, and it was quite surprising to me at the time. And of course, I immediately did some further investigation. But going back to my medical training to help echo what you were saying before, I think there are two significant things about how they train doctors, at least in the United States. And one thing is that they have told us as medical students, and right from day one, that 50% of what they were going to teach us about medicine is going to turn out to be false in 5 years. And, that's a pretty bold statement. And I think people interpreted it as meaning that there's going to be better and better treatments and it's going to improve. But that's not really what they meant. And I think, you can look at John Ioannidis' article in PLOS One talking about how most published research findings are false. And I think that's really what they were talking about. But when they taught us about different diseases, including, infectious disease and many others, they told us what caused the disease, but they never presented the evidence of how that was discovered. They just said basically that it was a fact, and all of the other knowledge that we were taught was built on those fundamental principles that we never investigated the scientific basis for. So the fact that you were able to look at this problem and say, you know what? Is there really this primary scientific evidence to show that these are the causes of illness is such a brilliant way to approach it, because if there isn't, then it would crumble down the whole body of knowledge, because if it's built upon a false foundation, it cannot stay erect.
Exactly. And this is this is what we found. And the more we looked, and we tested our hypothesis. We thought, well, the more we look, the less we're finding any evidence to support what the medical establishment say. So we looked at various diseases. We took some of the biggies to start with, and looked for the evidence for either bacterial or viral causes. Couldn't find any. I mean, we can talk about this in more detail. We do, of course, I might add, explain it in our book in detail. That's why it's nearly 800 pages.
Right. Well, could you give an example of an illness that our audience would be familiar with in the infectious space that was really surprising what you learned about it?
Well, one possibly is, and again, I don't know if it's being compared to now, but the what's called Spanish flu, 1918 flu. Everyone says, it's caused by a virus, and it was one of the most deadly, and there's millions of people died. And I mean, that's one of the puzzles when you look at it, that some of the figures say, 10 million, 20 million, some say 100 million. But then when we started looking, we found some writings of people sort of contemporary or sort of soon after. We found some writings where, I mean, at the time they thought, first of all, it was bacterial. Then they couldn't find bacteria, so then they thought it was viral, or they said it was viral. But everyone says, it was influenza. But the more we
Dawn, that's there's a parallel to the COVID-19, because when the first people were sick in Wuhan, China, they first thought it was a bacterial illness and treated them with antibiotics. And then when they did not recover, then they made the leap that it must be a virus. So it's like the same exact paradigm as was 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yes, and they, again, it was a worldwide phenomenon. Millions of people died, although. But one of the things, of course, that is conveniently left out of the discussion is the fact that was at the tail end of a pretty horrendous, 4-year. I know it wasn't 4 years for the Americans, but it was the end of a 4-year war. But also when people say, 1918 flu, we discovered that there were there were health problems that started earlier and it carried on later. So it wasn't just that 1 year. But when we sort of digging into various reports, all kinds of documentation of the time or soon afterwards, finding that there were multiple illnesses, there were various different people were affected, or different areas of the world were affected differently. So one of the writings was from, I don't know if you're familiar with Eleanor McBean, The Poison Needle.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, she describes some of the problems, and in one of I believe it was one of the American camps, thousands of American soldiers were dying soon after, surprisingly, receiving vaccines, because they were given loads of vaccines.
Wow. So they had a Spanish flu vaccine at the time?
No, vaccines for all kinds of things, typhoid or whatever.
Oh, right. Smallpox and diphtheria, I think is.
Yes, they
had at the time, right?
Yeah, they were given a number of vaccines pretty much at the same time. So, there are parallels again with Gulf War syndrome. So the Gulf War, they're given lots of vaccines, and so that can be attributed to so that the soldiers dying in the camps could be attributed to that. But that's not the case for everyone. So there were different places around the world where they're claiming that it's all part of the flu. And yet when you actually start looking into what was going on, the evidence isn't there that it's flu, that people were ill, but we found lots of other reasons, one of which I can't remember the title of it's a long article, but about aspirin. So that was actually causing people to have really serious respiratory problems because they were giving aspirin in very high doses.
Right.
So a paper, I can't remember.
Right. They've always taught us in medical school that aspirin can make asthma worse. So perhaps it's a similar mechanism to that. So it seems like you're saying actually that the Spanish flu may have not been one illness, but it may have been a combination of different illnesses.
Definitely.
And that there's really no evidence that there was an influenza virus causing it. So Dawn, maybe you can introduce to us, like, how, if you were a scientist or a health researcher, how would you go about proving that a virus was responsible for causing an illness?
Well, I think to our sort of simple minds, if you like, as we said right at the beginning, you've got to sort of follow the evidence and see what proof you've got. One is identifying that a virus, any virus, these sort of tiny particles, which they only discovered once they'd invented the electron microscope, which I think, just in case any of your listeners are in any doubt, these are not the nice big 3D moving pictures that you see on the media. You know, those are just computer generated images. That is not what you see down an electron microscope. They're just black and white, you would see, and certainly not moving. So we would want to see that someone could actually prove that whatever the particle was that they were identifying as the cause of the particular illness, and this goes for any virus, is that they have some proof to show that it's actually invading cells and actually destroying cells in some massive way to cause an illness, and for this to be written up scientifically. And it's that information we were looking for, primary papers that proved conclusively that they'd got a virus which was fully categorized and described and had definite proof that it was the cause of whatever disease they were specifying. And it's those papers that we've never caught sight of, and Carrie Mullis was referring to with HIV. Right. They're not there for any of these cases. So it's surmising. There seems to be a lot of it is just built on people are one is misinterpreting what data they've looked at and then making suppositions from those misinterpretations.
Right.
It's 2 and 2 makes 5. And I think that's why your latest piece of work on exosomes is so important, where obviously there's more information available now, but I think people are still making those basic mistakes of misinterpreting what they see and making it out to be something else.
Right. So you're saying that you have not found any experimental evidence from research papers that they've actually had people ill with an illness like the flu and been able to show in that person that they could isolate and purify a virus out of the sick people, and they would not be able to isolate that out of healthy people, right? And then they would be able to show that that virus particle was actually responsible for damaging tissue in the body.
Correct, yes.
And that there's no evidence of that for the flu or, in fact, any other virus that is told to us that causes illness.
Correct, yes. Yes.
One of the things that we did, as I suggested with, the 1918 flu, is that we went back to, well, what does, questioning what does the word virus mean, and realised that it comes from the Latin for poison or noxious substance, and because obviously looking at illnesses and took us to the vaccination topic, which is there's so much connected. So we looked at some of the very original work and reports about the work of Edward Jenner, and a lot of material that was written by a number of eminent scientists and doctors at the time that looked into the topic of vaccination and called it a superstition. They called it a fraud, a hoax. So a lot of those papers, eminent physicians. There was Dr. Charles Crichton, who at one point was asked to write the vaccination article, I think, for the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1890 something, I think. So we're going back a long way.
That was before Wikipedia, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, yes. Encyclopedia Britannica still, got
still around.
Yeah, it's still
Yes.
around. Obviously not used as much as Wikipedia, but at the time he was very much pro vaccines. there weren't that many at the time, but again, he was pro-vaccine. But instead of just writing the standard explanation of vaccination for his article, he decided to go back and have a look at it. And when he actually looked at the science behind it, he said there is no science behind vaccination. He called it a superstition. Others have called it a fraud around the same kind of time. Now, the point of vaccines, not originally to prevent against viruses in the same way it is now. It was to, induce a mild form of the disease, so which was supposed to protect you against a more virulent version.
Right.
It's been used, obviously, since they had the electron microscope and were able to find these smaller particles. But so much of the literature of that kind of time, when they were freer to talk about these things, shows that not only was vaccination regarded as a superstition and not based on science, but some of those same doctors, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but some of those same doctors had looked into the germ theory, and they said the same thing, that there is no scientific basis for the idea that any germ causes any disease, which was quite astounding. And these again are, medically qualified doctors of the early 20th century, thereabouts, and they were pretty much, they have been pretty much kind of put to one side. It takes some digging to find this kind of information. And you say, how did we look? Well, we've spent a very long time preparing preparing the material. So it's I can't tell you how many hours, hundreds of hours we've spent. Really. Reading all these kind of documents. And if in the early 20th century there's no scientific basis for the idea that for the germ theory, and no germs have been shown to be the causes of any disease, if that was the case in the early 20th century, it's still the case now, because nothing's changed.
So this is really incredible stuff. And something occurred to me while you were talking, because there are very small particles that you can see in the electron microscope, right, that have been labeled as a virus. But it's very important, the power of language, because if you take those particles and you don't know what they really are, but you apply the term virus to them, that automatically makes them the bad guy. Right. Absolutely. And my understanding is that the term virus was actually used in medical research before the advent of the microscope, and they even knew that any microorganisms existed. Right. And it's sort of akin to the concept of a miasma, which is some kind of foul substance in the air, right, that can cause disease. And certainly we know that air pollution is such a thing, right? And we know about black mold that people have in homes, right, that has some kind of toxic particle or substance in the air that we breathe that makes us sick. So there is some certainly truth to that has been shown scientifically. So I think this is a good segue into talking a little bit about germ theory and Koch's postulates. So let me ask you, what was the actual evidence that supported the initial idea of the germ theory?
Well, I think, we're going back now probably about 150 years, something like that. Well, it does actually go back further, but most people think of it in terms of originating with Louis Pasteur, who I'm sure most people have heard of.
Right. But Louis Pasteur, all of his ideas were stolen from someone else, weren't they?
Pretty much. And it's good to remember that he was a chemist, so he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a proper scientist, really.
Whereas Antoine Béchamp was.
Yes, a contemporary who was a scientist, and he knew pretty much that the things that Pasteur was putting out were unfounded. But like in all these things, people latch onto it who see that there's a way to make some money, and that's exactly what happened. But that's a bit more of a longer story. But suffice it to say, at the time when people were looking as to what could be possibly making people ill, and they were able with their optical microscopes to examine the blood, And first of all, they could only see what we now know as bacteria. And it was while they were looking at bacteria that they made the first fundamental mistake, really, because they would see in the blood bacteria clustered around probably dead or dying cells, and made the basic mistake of the bacteria were the cause of the dead and dying cells, rather than realizing that they're actually part of the body's cleanup system. And so we often liken it to people seeing firemen around a burning house and then blaming the firemen for the fire.
Wow. So the firemen are like the bacteria in this example, right?
Yeah. If you misinterpret what you're seeing, which is what has been done, certainly with bacteria. And so they got labeled the bad guys because it was misunderstood what they were doing. But cutting a very long story short, that was the first basic mistake. But then they realized they couldn't attribute everything to bacteria at the time, so they guessed that there must be something else, but they couldn't see it. And it wasn't until about the 1930s, when the electron microscope was invented, that they could then see smaller particles in the blood, which then got the misnomer, rather than the word virus meaning a toxic substance.
Right.
The particles got called viruses, and they were labeled the bad guys ever since. And obviously the pharmaceutical companies have found these very useful things
Right.
Invent new ones and blame them on just about everything you can think of.
David, when early on, when they realized that not all diseases had bacteria associated with that under the microscope, they were routinely using medicines made of mercury and arsenic in that era. And we now know that those are extremely toxic substances, especially to the central nervous system, but actually to all of our body systems. Did they ever consider that some of the illness may be actually caused by their own medications?
Well, they don't seem to have done, because, in those days, obviously, for many years, things like syphilis was prevalent in certain quarters.
Hundreds of years.
And, the doctors of the time were treating syphilis with sort of mercury potions and ointments, which you think, now we may laugh at it and think, well, crikey, that's a recipe for disaster. But this was the medical establishment. They thought that was quite a useful thing to do. So, yes, in many instances, and we may move on to it, the treatment is worse than the disease that they were supposed to be treating. And we had a very similar parallel, didn't we, with the onset of HIV/AIDS, where certainly in the early days in the 80s, where they started treating people with very high dose AZT, which, there are many people now have looked at it and they realize that all the people they treated with that particular dose of AZT all died. And we've come across some doctors, some German doctors, that admit that it was the AZT that killed them, and
right.
So that's been happening a lot. And I often like to quote Napoleon, people might not, where he said to his physician that one day it will be discovered that you physicians are responsible for more deaths than all us generals put together. And I think that's a very interesting quote.
There is another, there are actually quite a lot of parallels between syphilis and HIV with the tests. Just the way they tested and what they were testing for.
Right. Because the test is an antibody test. It's not a culture of the bacteria that they say causes syphilis, correct?
Sure.
And syphilis has got has been recognised as something that's not necessarily got a significant kind of set of symptoms. There's again a particularly useful small booklet by Herbert Shelton, who was a doctor of chiropractic who has written a book, Syphilis. Is it a I can't remember the full name, but he's quite detailed in how he describes a lot of the way they were testing for syphilis. They'd test a whole family, not because they thought it was sexually transmitted, but because they thought that children of parents who had syphilis would be defective, So, so they were presenting this test, the Wasserman test.
Yeah,
presumably, yes,
yeah.
Wasserman test,
Okay.
and also, and if people who wanted to get married, particularly in America, I believe this was the case, that if the people who wanted to get married had to have the test and have a negative test result,
Right.
and if
I think that's still true.
really,
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
I believe it was when I got married earlier in my life.
Yeah.
wow. But the thing is that there's a story of somebody who received a positive test and who was so devastated he committed suicide, and soon afterwards he got a note from the medical people telling him that the test result was wrong and he was actually negative.
Wow.
I mean, those kind of things are
Right.
heartbreaking, and you think, no, that's a huge mistake to make.
And as we all know, who've looked into it, there's some direct comparisons with that and the HIV test, which has been shown by many people to be totally unsatisfactory and totally reliable. But of course, getting a positive test can devastate people's lives forever once they're tested HIV positive. But it's based on no sound science whatsoever.
Right. Well, so I think that's a really important point to drive home, that that these interactions with the healthcare system can have a really profound effect on people's lives. And, you know, the HIV test is particularly problematic because there are over 50 conditions that can give you a positive result. And some of these are extremely common, like receiving a hepatitis B vaccination, being pregnant after the first time, right, for subsequent pregnancies. And so these, you know, almost everybody has these experiences and then could end up having a positive HIV test, which can change the rest of your life.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So it really, and this is sort of a worrying, has worrying consequences for what's probably going to be happening around the coronavirus thing, you know, where they're officially putting tests together based on PCR, which again, people should remember, Kary Mullis, the inventor of PCR, has said this is not what it was designed for. You know, this is going to give you inappropriate tests and unreliable tests, and yet they're going ahead and doing it. And I'm pleased to see on your presentation, yeah, I think you do mention that. And you can see what's going to happen. People are going to line up for their tests and they're going to be told, oh yes, you're positive or whatever, and then they're going to, all sorts of dire consequences are going to come out of that, not least of which might be this new vaccination that they're feverishly trying to put together, which we may not get time today, but vaccinations are a whole subject on their own, and just what's in them and what their benefits are, which are none, as we found.
Well, David, I would definitely like to do a subsequent discussion about that issue, because, you know, that's something that I've also talked about and done quite a bit of research on. But let's get back a little bit to the germ theory, because it occurs to me that when dealing with bacteria are pretty easy to work with in the laboratory. We know how to grow them, right? And we can, like you said, demonstrate that bacteria are present in various diseases that we have, right? Like everyone knows about strep throat, that you could easily take the Streptococcus bacteria out of someone and grow it in a culture. So wouldn't it be a pretty easy experiment to do, to just take that bacteria that we think causes a disease and put it in a healthy person's body, and they would get the same disease, right?
Well, this, of course, has been tried, you know, because this is sort of Koch's postulate. His first postulate really says that anyone with a certain named disease should always exhibit the agent, the germ that's causing it. But there's many instances where, and that's a sound thing, you know, that's a sound thing to do. But there are many instances where that doesn't occur. So someone can have the disease prescribed by the medical establishment, and the germ that is supposed to cause it is not present in their body. So you realize straight away there's something wrong. And the converse of that, you know. You
mean that the germ is in their body, but they're not sick?
Yes, you can have that, and that they're sick and they don't have the germ in their body. So it makes a nonsense of the whole thing, really. But this is, of course, another one of the flaws that we found within the lack of science, if you like, and the teachings of the medical establishment.
Right.
What
Well, the
I've
example, 1 second, Don, the example
Yeah.
about strep throat that I mentioned,
Yeah.
I never questioned that initially, but in recent years when people are starting to wake up and recognize about the microbiome, that we have healthy bacteria and they're actually crucial for our body to function and for us to survive. Well, one of those normal bacteria is Streptococcus.
Yeah.
So how could it be a normal bacteria and then also cause disease occasionally?
Yes.
Exactly.
Well,
Go on.
sorry. This is one of many anomalies that we came across where stuff that's in your body all the time, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not, which is a nonsense, and it goes quite against Koch's postulates, which are supposed to be some of the sort of bywords of the medical establishment. And yes, there's all sorts of things that like that, and all sorts of examples which we do put in the book so that people can see for themselves the inconsistencies, contradictions, and plain nonsense that. And this is why we came to the conclusion that medicine, as practiced in Western medicine, is not a science. It's more a dogma, more a belief system. It's not based on sound science. That's not, of course, what you're told. We're all told that it is a science, but when you look into it, and believe me, this was a shock to us, because we always grew up thinking it was a science, but it's not. And I'm just trying to think of the doctor's name, the medical heretic.
Robert Mendelssohn.
Dr. Robert Mendelssohn.
If I can,
he wrote quite an interesting book as a practicing doctor with a large profession, and he said it's more akin to a religion than it is a science, and that's
Wow.
Coming from a doctor.
Yeah, that quite is. What did you want to add, Dawn?
No, if we can go back to when you were saying about the strep throat, you said if you put the bacterium into a healthy person, the thing that needs to be done first is to actually test the healthy person if they have that particular bacterium present in the first place before you put the bacterium into their body. So just because you find it after you've got, not you, but after it's been theoretically put into the person, they might already have that. I mean, the Staphylococcus as well is another one that is found commonly on the skin, various parts of the body in healthy people, and yet it's supposed to be part of one of these superbugs, the MRSA. And again, how can something that is found in healthy people be something that causes disease? Because by definition, if it causes disease, it must cause disease in every case. Koch's first postulate. So if it doesn't cause disease, if it can be present without causing disease, it cannot be the cause of disease. And so we work with logic, and we think that's common sense, that's logic. How can it be twisted? Oh, well, sometimes it might. And so when we find these anomalies and think, well, sometimes it might cause disease, and in certain circumstances it might cause disease. But what are the circumstances? And we kept looking and reading. What are the circumstances? They don't explain it,
right?
Or they don't. It's just not there.
It sounds like a very convenient justification, doesn't it?
Sure.
Oh, it works, because it certainly works to blame viruses and bacteria, because the real causes, the things that really cause illness, are things that are normal to everyday life. And of course, that makes lots of money for all these different industries, which we all may go into at another time. But again, it's convenient to.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking you could say, okay, so let's say that there's a thunderstorm, right? And some people get the symptoms of an illness occurring the same day as the thunderstorm. Well, you could say that the thunderstorm caused the illness, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Right. And then if you said, well, what about all the people who didn't get sick from the thunderstorm? Well, you'd say, oh, well, because it only makes you sick some of the time. There are other factors involved. Right.
Or that they have natural immunity. which is another favourite thing they come up with. But yes, they're great at coming up with excuses, but again,
not explanations.
Unsubstantiated. And this is what we were looking for all the time. Well, we believe, well, if you can make a statement, but that's your theory. But if you're proposing the theory, then it's important that you can also prove what your theory is. And I always like to mention the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who once said otherwise. It's akin to me saying, Bertrand Russell, I believe that there's a chocolate teapot orbiting Mars, and you've got to believe me unless you can prove it's false.
Right. Well, this is a really, really critical issue because, I've been talking about some of the same concepts that we're discussing today, and there's a lot of people that want to have a nice explanation for, it seems like people pass disease to each other through contagion, right? And that is totally built upon this idea that there's an infectious agent that causes the disease, and then we somehow pass that back and forth between each other. And in some ways, based on our personal experience, it does seem like that may occur because, it might be several people get sick at the same time in our family or in our child's classroom, right? But there easily could be many, many other explanations for that as well. But since we have this belief that there's an infectious germ causing the illness, well, it makes a nice explanation. But what I'm trying to tell people is that it doesn't really matter if contagion is true or not, because if there's actually no germ causing the illness, it doesn't matter. Right? Because in order to understand it, you have to then go back and find out, well, what actually is causing the illness? And then see, well, how do you get that? And does it make sense that could pass from person to person? Or does it come from a common source? Right? Or is it part of some kind of biological program that is a normal function in some way?
Well, the contagion stroke infection question is something that comes up quite a bit when we're talking to people. And, we'll always get little stories about, their little Johnny, shall we say, goes to a party at someone's house and all the kids mix together and they all come down with measles or chickenpox or something like that. So therefore, they think contagion or infection must be a fact. And our sort of answer to that is that, first of all, as we show in the book, if you take away the fact that there are no bacterial or virus causes of disease, that cannot be proved. So we're not denying that, okay, all the kids get ill, let's say, or a high percentage of them. So therefore, there must be some other factors, which obviously we can't be aware of. We'd have to know what their environment is, what their food and drink is, what their medicine and vaccine schedules are, to be able to stand any chance of being able to put a guess together as to what makes them ill. But we also, and I've sort of thought about this to give a little example, to sort of show people that appearances are not always what they seem. And I sort of have given a little example in the past, just to observe lightning. Now, whenever we see lightning in a storm, it looks like it comes from the clouds down to the earth. But in actual fact, just the opposite is what happens. The electrical charge, it may surprise me, the electrical charge actually comes from the earth up to the clouds. But why you see the optical illusion is because the atmosphere is thinner near the clouds and more dense near the ground. So the electrical charge, as it passes up from the earth, heats the thinner atmosphere quicker and progressively slower as it comes to the earth. So you get this optical illusion that the charge comes from the clouds down to the earth, but it's an illusion. The charge comes from the earth to the clouds, but your observation would tell you otherwise. And so we're trying to give that as a little example so that people start to realize that just because you see a certain thing, it can be very misleading. And that's a prime example.
Wow. So let me just see if I understand that correctly, because I'm taken back by surprise with what you just said about lightning. I need to brush up on my physics knowledge. Okay. But it seems that what you're saying is that the lightning actually doesn't come from the sky down to the ground. It goes the opposite direction, but we see it as if it's coming down to the ground because it basically heats up the air quicker in the upper atmosphere because there's less air to heat up.
Yes.
Right. So we see the light from that heat first.
Yes.
And so it's just like if you had, 2 pots of water and one pot had a gallon of water and one pot had a pint of water, the pint would boil first.
Sure. That's
right?
exactly it. That's exactly it.
Wow, that's amazing. So we can really observe something and without very, very careful scrutiny can be completely fooled as to the explanation of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Or even the nature of what we're seeing. Exactly.
Yes. And contagion stroke infection is exactly that. An observation is made and a false conclusion is drawn from that because people aren't aware of all the facts that actually could cause it.
Right. Isn't the reason for Koch's postulates to make sure that we don't have these kinds of errors in our reasoning when we're figuring out the cause of disease, right? And so just to summarize about Koch's postulates, so I believe there's actually 4 postulates, right? And this is the requirement from Robert Koch, a famous German scientist who is a proponent of germ theory. And in fact, even in Germany now, they have the Robert Koch Institute. It's the most prestigious scientific establishment studying medically related science, right? And those postulates, the first one, which is just that sick people have this germ and healthy people don't have it.
Yeah.
Just that first one has not even been satisfied for any infectious disease.
Absolutely.
So we don't even need the other 3 because the first one, the most basic one, has not been satisfied.
Yeah.
That's what we concentrated in the book because that one follows complete logic. And if that one fails, as you say, the other 3 are pretty much irrelevant because, but even at the time of Robert Koch, even even his experiments didn't fulfill those postulates. No so-called infectious disease has actually fulfilled those postulates. There's just nothing.
Wow, this is so mind-blowing because that almost the entire foundation and paradigm of modern allopathic medicine is based on germ theory. And there's a good reason why it's called germ theory and not germ law, right? Yes. Or germ fact, because as you're saying, there's actually no experimental evidence to support it in any way.
Yeah.
Right. And wasn't there even one scientist who took this a step further and swallowed a really dangerous or allegedly dangerous germ?
Yes. Max Pettenkofer. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but yes. No, I mean that there's some people say it's just a sort of urban myth, but it certainly
was documented.
Yes, exactly. It's documented. In fact, in a couple of occasions in his class, in front of his students, he swallowed a beaker of so-called cholera bacteria. Yeah, and absolutely didn't suffer. So yes, but since. As I said, since those times, but I mean, more and more investigations of the nature of bacteria and what they actually do. There are at least as many bacteria in the body as cells, or approximately, it's been approximated that, about the same kind of number, which is...
Really? I thought there were 10 times as many.
Yes, I've seen variations, but... There are certainly a similar number, so which are tens of trillions of, so plenty of bacteria, and it's even admitted that only a few of them are potentially dangerous. But part of the role of the rest of them apparently is to protect the body from these dangerous ones. So if they're supposed
I don't think we necessarily accept that, though.
No, we don't accept that. But again, it's the whole idea that the bad bacteria are just there's just a few of them. There are only a few of them that are bad, and the rest of them are good. So why don't the good ones outnumber? Well, that they outnumber them, but why don't they overwhelm them? But again, it's completely misunderstanding the role of bacteria or the functions in the body. I mean, they have extremely beneficial functions, and one of them is that they're saprotrophic. that they're part of the decomposition of dead and dying material from the body. So they are not just in the gut, but everywhere. So you'll find them everywhere. They are essential for the cleanup process.
Well,
getting
the
rid
life
of
on Earth. They're essential
the
for life on Earth.
Right.
Life wouldn't exist without them.
And certainly the human body, life, the living organism of the body.
Right.
We need them.
And a lot of the various chemicals and toxins that we're exposed to in modern life actually are deadly for those bacteria, aren't they? Like glyphosate is a great example of this, because bacteria are closely related to plants in much of their chemistry. And the chemical pathway that glyphosate, which is Roundup, works on is actually conserved. So it's the same pathway in bacteria and plants. So when you eat foods that have been doused with glyphosate, and it, by the way, it penetrates into the flesh of the fruits and vegetables. It's not something that you can just wash off and completely get rid of. So you're basically killing the bacteria in your gut and perhaps elsewhere in your body by that, right? And this disrupts our normal physiologic functioning, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, in the book, we describe these things in detail so that people can understand. It's a bit like a detective story. So we do sort of encourage people to start at the beginning and read through to the end, so that they're in no doubt as to the lack of science, and not only the lack of science to prove what the medical establishment says, but to give more plausible reasons, much more plausible reasons, for why these various diseases, because we looked at it in not only humans, but also in animals as well, to see whether the things like, we had a big thing in the UK with what was commonly called mad cow disease, and we investigated that to see what it was. And we're able to find that in the UK, it was down to the UK government's insistence that the farmers, when they dipped their cattle, used very high dosed organophosphates, which attack the central nervous system of the cows. Hence, they appeared to go mad and die.
Because the wash was put on their neck, so obviously it seeped into their brains.
Wow, this is incredible. This is particularly important for my clinical work, because I often actually recommend that people eat cow brain as a nutritional supplement to help them repair nervous tissue that may be damaged. And actually, it's quite effective. But it's hard to acquire because there are regulations based upon this myth of mad cow disease. So for example, a friend of mine that wanted to try this, he went to a butcher and asked about it, and the butcher, kind of said, "This isn't for eating, right?" And he said, "No, I'm doing an anatomy experiment." and that was the only way that he would actually sell it to him.
Well, of course, as I say, there is a danger there, because I know it was particularly prevalent in the UK because of these crazy laws that the government put out, where it was high dose, which didn't appear to happen in any other countries. And that's why it was more prevalent in the UK than it was anywhere else. And this is what we wanted to get to the bottom of, and then we found out why. But of course, because it goes into the central nervous system of the cow, sends them crazy and kills them, there were instances, so-called instances of it happening to people to a lesser extent. Well, obviously people eating that infected meat, poisoned meat, let's give it its correct term, poisoned meat, could ingest some of those organophosphates, which are very toxic, and could then exhibit similar things, certainly become ill. So you have to, for anyone who is going to eat their meat, or certainly cow's brains, would need to be very careful, I would think, to see what the source was, and whether those animals had been treated with organophosphates.
Absolutely.
I mean, effectively, it was supposed to be for something fairly innocuous. It was, I think it was warble fly, which damages the hides of the cows and makes it less valuable when it's sold for leather.
I see. So it's an economic reason. It's not a disease that was causing any real problems to the cows, right? So this idea we're saying here, like a really scary illness, right? The mad cow disease, people were definitely frightened about that when there were major headlines. And you're saying it's actually not caused by any type of infectious agent, but it's caused by a toxic substance.
Sure.
So have you found evidence of other diseases that we were told were infectious that were actually caused by a toxic substance?
Well, we
all of them.
Yeah.
We found the toxic contributory factors for most diseases. We could see that various toxins at different times were involved. But the idea that there's only one cause for one disease is another paradigm that needs to be broken, because it just doesn't fit. There will always be a multiple combination of factors that contribute to different people's illnesses, and for almost every single person will have a different combination, will be exposed to a different combination. And that's why, as David said before, you have to look at each individual person's intake, nutritional intake, exposures environmentally, air pollution, things indoors, electromagnetic fields.
We boiled it down to 4, as we explain all
Yes.
these things in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult in a relatively short space of time to sort of explain what took us years to put together and write about in 800 pages, and that's leaving lots out. But we do explain it in more detail in the book, and we do explain what we found the causes of illness to be, and of course then you know what to avoid. But I was just going to give what I found interesting, because we looked into dentistry as well. And there's some very interesting things come out of dentistry, and I can't remember the guy's name, but maybe another time, because he did write a book about it.
Not Weston A. Price.
No.
But he'd done
Hal Huggins.
That's it. Say that again.
Hal Huggins. And yeah. Thomas Levy.
An American dentist, with a large practice. And he'd been doing some experimentation. And this particular case that he talked about was a young girl who he was working on, but had been diagnosed with leukemia. And he got permission to take out all her fillings, and which he did. And within a very short space of time, her leukemia had gone. And then he got permission to put her fillings back, which he did, and the leukemia came back. And that was quite an interesting. And that's a documented...
Wow. Well, I hope he took them out the second time.
Yes. but the interesting thing was that when the leukemia went away, the doctor that who was treating her had said, "Oh no, it's nothing to do with the fillings."
And that's
yet how
And that's
how
why
much
also, how do we treat leukemia today? We basically give people poison, and actually the chemotherapy for leukemia is among the most aggressive, most cytotoxic chemotherapy that exists.
Wow.
Right, because they're trying to the strategy is to come as close as possible to completely obliterating the bone marrow, which is where all of our blood cells are made, and just to leave a few healthy stem cells, hopefully, that can regrow the blood. And I've not seen that strategy be successful in one individual in my personal experience when I used to do that kind of work. But I think another great example to bring up, and this example shows an illness that's thought to be infectious, caused by not just one toxin, but over time there was a shift in the poison that caused the disease. And what I'm talking about is related to the gypsy moth, which was an invasive species brought over from Europe to the United States. And it was kind of devastating because it would completely clear all the foliage off of a common type of tree in the forest. I can't remember which tree, but essentially, and then it would also damage all of the crops on the farm. So it was affecting the food supply. So there was like a panic. What are we going to do about this invasive gypsy moth, because it had no natural predators? And someone came up with this idea of using lead arsenate, right, which has both arsenic and lead. And I think everybody knows now that those are very poisonous metals, right? And we all think of arsenic as something that can be used to poison someone like in a homicide, right? Because there's literature about that, right? Arsenic and old lace. So we're very familiar with this. But at that time, people were mixing up solutions of this, in their backyard with a hose. They were not using any protective equipment, and they're basically spraying it to cover every tree, everything in their garden, right? All of the summer fruits. So they started spraying every year, in the spring, right? And then we started seeing this huge epidemic of poliomyelitis, right? And I want to clarify that the term poliomyelitis actually is not the name of a virus. It's the name of a specific type of lesion in the spinal cord. And if someone dies from this condition, you can actually dissect their spinal cord and look under a microscope and see a very specific type of damage that's been labeled as poliomyelitis, and can be easily recognized as the cause of this illness, which causes paralysis is the main thing, and it can be progressive and can cause your breathing muscles to not work anymore, right? And we all remember stories about the iron lungs that were trying to get people through that. So there is a very strong correlation to this spraying and the prevalence of that disease. And this continued for quite a while, and ultimately was not successful at removing the invasive moth, by the way. But at some point they realized that it was either not successful or that it was causing some kind of damage, and a new chemical had been invented called DDT.
Yep.
And so they switched from lead arsenate to DDT, and then the cases of poliomyelitis continued, but actually there was a slight change in the clinical pattern of how people were sick, right? Yes. So you have all this evidence of the timing of it, and then polio was a season. It was like only in the summer were kids getting paralyzed, right? And of course, kids are more vulnerable to poisons because they have less body mass to spread it around in. Right, and they also may have smaller livers to detoxify. Not that your body's not able to really handle metals, because we really don't. We're not exposed to metals very much in the natural world. This is really a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, right? So it's very devastating. So you see basically this pattern of one poison causing the illness and then switching to another poison, because, with DDT, there are all these stories that kids playing in the summer, when the trucks came by to spray DDT, that they would actually go in the spray and they were encouraged to by their families, right? Because it was going to protect them from getting some kind of disease or something, and meanwhile, it was actually causing the disease.
Yeah, yes, we do cover the polio, DDT, lead arsenate. Yes, that's sort of covered in the book.
It's all in there.
Yes. Have you read Silent Spring?
Of course, Rachel Carson. I read that in college.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so
that's quite a hard read, but I mean. Such an important piece of work to put out there, and yet they absolutely vilified her. Dreadful. What?
Right, and look what the environmental movement has become. It's been focused on things that aren't really affecting our health. Right, when meanwhile all of the companies are still able to dump all these poisons, everywhere, and many of them are unregulated at all. Like there's a pesticide called atrazine that has been shown to, when like frogs and amphibians are exposed to it, they become hermaphrodites, meaning they have both male and female genitalia, right? So this is just one example of a pretty potent chemical that is a endocrine mimicker. So it mimics sex hormones for us and causes perturbations of sexual development. And this is not regulated at all in the United States. The EPA said there was insufficient evidence to regulate this drug. And so you can use it, at your will and spread it around everywhere. So if we started to investigate this in the mainstream and saw that it's actually these poisons and toxins we're exposed to that are causing the illness, boy, there would be a lot of anger and protest among the general public, wouldn't there?
Well, this is it. And of course, this is problem, and we're seeing a prime example of it now with the coronavirus scare, is just how complicit the mainstream media is in the in the fraud, really. I mean, you imagine if the mainstream media wasn't covering this coronavirus thing in the way they are, with all the scare stories on a almost 24-hour basis, day by day, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful from the government's point of view of this lockdown, which they've locked down practically the world, putting companies out of business, putting people out of jobs, high rates of suicide, all based basically on a lie. We're quite convinced with our studies of the nonsense behind viruses causing these diseases. So we know that the basis of that story cannot be true. So if people are getting ill, and that's a big if, because if there are people getting ill, then it's for some other reason. But I don't believe anything like those numbers can be true. And I did start having a look at, just for the UK, where the government publishes year on year, month on month, the death rates, right. total death rates in the UK. And you can see no change, so there's no spikes. And I shall keep watching that throughout this year. But because it stays fairly constant around, year in, year out. And if there's going to be some pandemic, as we're told, then you would expect to see spikes in that. But there isn't anything. There's nothing showing so far.
Well, I've looked at some of those data sources as well. I've seen the one from the UK government, and there's another one that looks at a bigger section of Europe called MOMO.
Yes.
Right. And so what they're looking at is called excess mortality. So in other words, so far in 2020, are more people dead this year than the average for any given year. Right. And this is a really important thing to monitor, because if there is some new type of illness that comes about, right, this is how we're going to capture it. That you're going to see an increase in total deaths. And then, that would be a signal to start investigating what could be causing it. And so this year, we're not seeing any spike like that at all. And I want to give some important numbers, because we're talking about, poisons and toxins being a major cause of illness, and most likely the explanation for virtually all of the diseases that we are told are infections, right? Specifically, and I'm sure also cancers. But if we look at the actual number of people who are dying from other things like pharmaceutical prescription drugs. Now, there was a study, and this is in the Journal of the American Medical Association, so this is not from a fringe research group at all. This is a very, very mainstream article. Of course, it didn't get any of the media coverage like this virus is, but it concluded that 128,000 people every year in the United States die from using prescription drugs as directed. So these are not people who took an overdose or who made a major mistake and, took 3 pills instead of 1. These are people who are actually following the instructions, and they die from the drugs. And, in my opinion, many of these drugs are poisons.
Oh,
right. And of course, that's why they would kill so many people. And that number just in the United States is just an order of magnitude higher than the total number of deaths worldwide from this corona, that are blamed on this coronavirus. Yeah. I agree with you that I've looked carefully at the papers alleging that this virus causes disease, and they once again have not satisfied Koch's first postulate at all. In fact, they haven't even directly isolated and purified any viral particle from people who are sick. They have to mix it with cells. And so I've seen 2 experiments. One, they mixed it with lung cancer cells, and lung cancer cells are sick and exhibit a lot of properties of disease. And so how do you know the particles don't come from the lung cancer cells? Yeah. And then the other experiment used what's called vero cells, which are derived from the monkey kidneys. And so those would be healthy cells, but what did they do? They added multiple antibiotics to it which are toxic to those cells, right? So basically you're creating toxic cells, and then who knows what the toxic cells put out. What I think is actually that they put out exosomes, which are our body's own way of protecting against a toxic exposure, that we put out these little sacs of fluid that contain some genetic material. And they've been demonstrated actually to be able to gobble up poisons and toxins. And they also signal other parts of our body to be on the lookout, or to send out the disposal team, or perhaps even to send out bacteria to clean it up, right? And so every experiment that I've seen where they claim to have isolated the virus, they've basically put it in a culture medium which is specifically designed to put out these exosomes. And the exosomes, and if you look at the electron microscope, right, like I've showed in my presentation, they are virtually identical in appearance.
Sure.
Right? So, but the thing is, if there are actually any deaths from any new illness, no one is looking into investigating what the cause of that could be, because they've said that it's the virus based on this very, very weak scientific data.
Yeah.
Yes, they won't be doing toxicological tests. Well, they just don't. I think they don't want to look for toxins.
No, I think most people who've looked into this, and also, what shall we say, the wider political agenda, without wanting to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I think if people look into what's been going on for a long time now, many decades, they'll realize there has to be some other agenda behind this, because no way could the governments of the world, and this is in the UK, everywhere, have been able to bring in these so-called emergency measures with very draconian and restrictive laws, which they've done, of locking people down in their homes and sort of arresting people if they appear to have gone out to see their children who live in another house on ridiculous pretenses. They wouldn't have been able to bring these things in without something, what they've done, where they've said, oh, we're only doing it to protect everyone because there's this deadly disease around. They'd never have got away with it. So it's a perfect vehicle for them to do what they've done. And I think the more we look into this and the more the truth comes out, they'll see what's really behind this so-called pandemic. And I do say so-called. I think the only pandemic there is in misrepresentation and bad testing.
Right, absolutely. So, Dawn and David, I think we've covered quite a bit of material. We've given a big overview, right, of everything basically related to infectious disease, and we've spoken our opinions, the conclusions that we've come to, that there's actually not even shaky evidence, but there's really no clear evidence to support even the first of Koch's postulates that any so-called microorganism infectious agent causes any disease. And I want to once again refer all the viewers to this excellent book, which in addition to laying out all of this, is extremely well referenced with its bibliography and footnotes, so that those people that want to look directly at the scientific papers themselves will be able to find out where the information's from. Because I know there's a lot of researchers out here listening to this, and they may not have looked into some of this biological and medical science, and this is a new area. So it's really such a great thing that you've indexed this so well that they can find the sources in the material. So do you have any final remarks? And also please take the opportunity to tell the listeners where they can find you.
Okay, well, we have a website, newly formed website, but there is an email address on it. So if people want to, it's nice and easy, because it's just whatreallymakesyouill.com. So and they can find us on there, and there's an email address that they can write to if they want to ask us some questions. But I hasten to add, where it's not a medical service. We would we don't want people to write to us and say, well, I've got this pain in my leg. No, I jest. But we hope that people will read the book, and then if there's something they don't understand, to contact us about that. They can get the book from any Amazon site. and they can buy it in either the paperback version, which you showed there, or they can get an ebook.
Can people buy the book directly from your website?
No. We deliberately steer clear of that and let Amazon take the stress of sort of orders and deliveries. That's down to them. They are quite good at it. Although we've had a few people not complaining about us, but complaining about Amazon, because under this present manufactured crisis, they're saying, well, we have to give priorities to other things. So people are getting slightly longer delays in the delivery of their books.
Right. Well, you could see why they might not want people to be reading your book right now.
Exactly.
Especially, right? Because it's going to definitely lead to question the official narrative. Yeah. Let me tell people out there that if you are looking for some help with your own medical problems, I do have a consultation service, and please, I encourage you to reach out to me. The contact information will be in the show notes, along with the name of Dawn and David's website, where you can find them, and I'll have a link to their book as well. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. As always, please click the like button below, and please come back for more shows. We've got some additional exciting shows coming up on Medicamentum Authentica. Thank you.
Thank you.